now we are nearing 6 p.m. So our next speaker is Sri Sunthar Visuvalingam, born in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, of Sri Lankan Tamil ancestry. He's an independent researcher on Indic traditions based in Chicago since 2001. His PhD thesis on Abhinavagupta's conception of humor, its resonances in Sanskrit drama, poetry, Hindu mythology, and spiritual practice in 1984 was strongly recommended for a D.Litt degree and earned him a personal commendation from the VC of BHU. He was instrumental in inviting foreign specialists to participate in the International Conference of Abhinavagupta at the BHU Musicology Department in 1981 and remained actively involved in the subsequent IGNCA National Conference there in 1982. He's collaborated throughout in his anthropologist wife, Dr. Elizabeth Shallier Visualingam's extensive fieldwork on the popular worship of Abhinavagupta, supreme tantric deity Bhairava in Banaras, Kathmandu, and elsewhere. The paradigm of transgressive sacrality was the object of a 3-panel pilot international conference at the South Asia Annual Conference at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Among their joint papers proposing an acculturation model of Indian religious history are a paradigm of Hindu-Buddhist acculturation, between Mecca and Banaras, an acculturation model of Hindu-Muslim relations, Bhairava in Banaras, and violence and the other in Hinduism and Islam. He's been guest editing the collective volume Abhinavagupta Reconsiderations, which includes papers from 2 BHU conferences, and his comprehensive introductory overview towards an integral appreciation of Abhinavagupta's aesthetics of rasa. He contributed the chapter on Hinduism, aesthetics, drama, and poetics to the Oxford Handbook of Religion and the Arts in 2014. His talk on Abhinavagupta, Centrality to Hindu Self-Understanding, Bori 2017, is a rebuttal of Western attempts to debunk Sanskrit aesthetics. His publications include Abhinavagupta's Rasa Aesthetics and Bharata's Sacrificial Theatre, Humor and its Semblance in the Little Clay Prichikatika, talk at IGNCA Delhi, and Carnival and Transgression in India Towards a Global Spring, based on his keynote address at this international conference, are inspired by the 10th century Kashmiri sage's constructive vision and way of thinking. Since 2001, Sundarji has been hosting and animating the swabhinava.org global website for collaborative multilingual publishing that aims to contemporize Abhinavagupta by applying and extending his insights, making them more accessible to non-specialists, otherwise deterred by the unnecessary jargon of academies. His presentation this evening is on Abhinavagupta on Rasa-dhvani, Emotion as Meaning. Sundarji, the floor is all yours. Thank you so very much for joining us this early from the US of A.
Thank you so much. Can I share my screen, please?
Absolutely. Please go ahead.
First of all, I'd like to thank, okay, very good. Nagaraj Garu.
Yes. Okay.
Don't show the slides, if you press forward, the bullets will appear one at a time. So I think that would be better for the audience, not to lose focus. So anyway, I'll rush through this because I only have 30 minutes left to speak. So I thank the INDICA Academy for hosting this collective homage to Abhinavagupta and inviting my contribution to your scholarly bouquet of flowers. Convener Nagaraj Garu, whom I originally got to know during his stint almost 20 years ago at the University of Chicago, has always regarded me as a worthy and sympathetic interlocutor. So I thank him for his blessings. I also thank servant leader Dimple Cow for reaching out and facilitating my participation in every way. And also my apologies to all the previous speakers for having been sound asleep during your presentations, not because you were boring, but due to the time difference. So I intend to listen carefully to your recordings on YouTube. So before I actually start the slides, this topic, I'd already covered it with a concise but thorough explanation of Rasa-dhvani in my introductory overview to the collective 2006 volume, Abhinavagupta Reconsiderations. That paper was titled Towards an Integral Appreciation of Abhinavagupta's Aesthetics of Rasa. And then later in 2017, I revisited the subject at the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute to rebut attempts by Western scholars, people like Sheldon Pollock, to debunk the whole notion. The links to both of these presentations are available in my speaker profile at the official INDICA Academy website for this conference. So you can always follow up for more details there. So why am I now rehashing something which I've already done before, and most of you, I think, already know quite well? Can you see the slide? Yes, please. Thank you. So, whereas those expositions did not isolate any single aspect of what is indeed a complex and multifaceted process, Rasa-dhvani, what I want to do now is to focus entirely on distinguishing rasa appreciation from what is called reader response theory in the West. Because most of this debunking involves, they say, rasa is a response of the reader, and therefore, this reader response theory has been discredited in the West. So this is the way the whole, so sometimes Anandavardhana is pitted against Tantraloka, saying that Anandavardhana focuses on the poem, whereas Abhinavagupta focuses on the Sayodaya. So all kinds of things. It's just one of the objections. So this is the reason why I think this is still a very misunderstood issue. So what I want to do now is actually focus on this notion of rasa as meaning. See, in the West, rasa, I mean, the emotion that the reader or the samajika feels is considered a response, not the meaning. You get the meaning from the poem or from the play, and you respond to it. But this is not what the Indian tradition says, starting with Bharata. It says the rasa is the meaning, artha. See, this is there already from Bharata. So how is this possible? So this is what, I'd like to delve into here. So now, in your speaker profiles, everybody has actually mentioned their gurus and, and the authority of their gurus. So who is our new universal Sarvajna guru? That is ChatGPT. So this artificial intelligence program, ChatGPT. So last night it occurred to me to ask ChatGPT this question. And it replied to me in this way. It said, Rasa, see, this is ChatGPT. The guru knows better than all these scholars like Pollock and Schulman and etc. It says, Rasa aesthetics is not the same as reader response theory. This is ChatGPT saying. Rasa aesthetics is an Indian aesthetic theory that focuses on the emotions that are evoked in the reader or audience by a work of art. In contrast, reader response theory is a literary theory that focuses on the reader's experience and interpretation of a text. While both theories are concerned with the role of the reader or audience in interpreting a work, they approach this issue from different perspectives. So ChatGPT says this quite categorically, but it doesn't explain why and how. So this is what I would like to do. Probably it doesn't read Sanskrit yet. So anyway.
No, ChatGPT has read you, Suntharji. ChatGPT has read you. We know it because when we asked for Abhinavagupta scholars, it gave your name.
Oh, it gave my name?
Yes. Yes.
I was quite surprised. I asked just to test it, what is so-and-so's theory of humor. And it actually gave a very accurate,
it knows you.
accurate summary.
ChatGPT knows you.
So what I'd like to do now is to rapidly illustrate the how and why of this difference between the two perspectives. Rasa as emotion, Rasa-dhvani, and reader response theory. And this argument is what I'm going to try and get through as much as possible in each of the following slides. So let's hear. So as you can see, I start off this Rasa aesthetics versus reader response theory. And it's very important. Rasa is not a subjective response. So they always play on this opposition between objective poem and subjective rasa. That's not how the Indian tradition sees it. So the aesthetic emotion is not a subjective response, but the poetic meaning. How can an emotion be a meaning? So that is the difficulty which many scholars have, in trying to wrap their mind around this idea. So, Rasa is already the meaning of drama in Bharata's foundational treatise. So, Bharata says this very clearly. Everything revolves around rasa. Without rasa, nothing else would work. And he calls rasa artha. So basically, the idea of rasa as meaning is already there. But the Natya Shastra is prayoga oriented. Bharata was not a philosopher. He was not even a kind of a linguistic rhetorician in the sense of Anandavardhana. So, but still already there, this idea, it's already there. So what happens with Anandavardhana? His notion of Dhvani aims to fill in the gap by accounting linguistically for rasa in poetry. Next, please. So that deals with the linguistic aspects of elements and structure of a particular verse or poem. But still, that doesn't explain how the rasa that we feel, how is that connected with what is there, the objective elements in the poem. So this is where Abhinavagupta comes in his commentary on the Lochana on Anandavardhana's Dhvani. So what he does is he elucidates the complex cognitive processes that sustain Rasa-dhvani. So we see there's a continuity, Bharata, Anandavardhana, Abhinavagupta, building on each other. Next, please. Okay, so what happens, according to Abhinavagupta very briefly, is that in the theatre, so he also commented on the Natya Shastra. And the two commentaries are actually unified. The same perspective, and by commenting on the two treatises, he actually provides a unified understanding of rasa for both theatre and poetics. So how do we enjoy this emotion? First of all, we enjoy the protagonist's feelings, say Rama or Sita, their love for each other, through a process which he calls Tanmayi Bhavana, which we can translate by identification. So these are processes which are not really taken into consideration in that much in rasa response, in reader response theory. In reader response theory, there are 10 different readers, each of them can have a different response to the poem. Whereas in rasa theory, all of us have the same. So that's why we have the next point, please. So we all participate in the protagonist's feelings through identification, Tanmayi Bhavana. And that is why the emotion, which is unique to Rama or Sita, all of us share in that same emotion through a process of universalization or generalization, which is called Sadharanikarana. So what Sadharanikarana implies is that all of us enjoy the same emotion. Okay, the emotion is the same, the substratum of that enjoyment is the same, the emotional substratum. And so we are not actually responding differently. If we respond differently, then the poem has failed from the Indian perspective. Next slide, please. Next, yeah. So in this context, what does it mean to translate poetry, to translate literature? I was recently at a translation workshop on Tamil literature at the University of Chicago, and one of the participants proposed that when we are translating, we want to translate the original idea. We want to translate the original idea in the poem. So we translate it into English. We want to produce the same idea. So that same idea may perhaps provoke different emotions in different people. But from the point of rasa poetry, and this is what Daniel Ingalls saw very clearly in his anthology of Sanskrit verses by Amaru, etc. So he understood that to translate, quote unquote, translate rasa poetry is really to re-render the original Sanskrit or whatever language to evoke the same emotion. So if you succeed in approximating the same emotion by using different words, even changing some of the elements of the poem, then the translation has been successful. If you simply translate the idea, maybe a very literal translation, and it doesn't evoke that emotion, and that's what usually happens when you literally translate, then you've not really translated the poem from this perspective. Next, please. So as I said right at the start, all of these objections to rasa theory confound rasa as meaning, which is what I am presenting, with the subjectivity of the reader response. Next slide, please. Now this is extremely important. Rasa is not just a concept. In fact, it is primarily not a concept. Rasa is a shared emotional experience. So when people watched a Sanskrit drama, they had an emotional experience which brought them together. So it was an experience. The conceptual formulation comes much later. Bharata mentions it, puts it at the center, but the reason why its conceptual formulation came so much later is that Indian philosophies, the various schools of Indian philosophy, which were all formulated to account for many different kinds of things like ritual, Advaitic experience, the world like Nyaya, all of them had concepts which were not adequate to account for the emotional experience, which is unique. So people needed to explore, experiment, come up with all kinds of different concepts before an adequate understanding, a conceptual understanding of this experience came about. I think this is important because even when like Anandavardhana, who wrote in the 9th century, gives examples of dhvani and Rasa-dhvani and all of that, he takes his examples from his predecessors like Kalidasa, etc. See? So that the principles which he is elucidating were operational much, much earlier than him. This is very important. It's not like if you debunk the concept, rasa as an experience no longer exists. Next point, please. So as I said, the performance-oriented Natya Shastra focuses, what it focuses is not so much on the rasa as experience, though it's taken for granted, but the on-stage dramatic configuration, vibhava, anubhava, vyabhichari bhava, etc., that configuration which evokes rasa. So it focuses on that. Next, please. So stimuli, vibhava evokes anubhava, responses, and vyabhicharins. So this is important because in the real world, we don't have all of these three. We basically, you see people have, behaving in a certain way, that a stimulus, then other people responding, etc. So these are emotions which engender purposive activity in the world. But really, when we watch drama or listen to poetry, it's more an act of contemplation. We are seeing all these things which we see in real life, but then we are trying to make sense of them by contemplating all of them together to see how they make sense. And ultimately, this sense is an emotional sense. So there's a big difference here. Next, please. So as I said, instead of reacting to stimuli, spectators try to make sense of interactions. Next. And as I said, this emotional experience is mediated through Tanmayi Bhavana, or identification. Next. For Bharata, rasa is the meaning around which everything resolves. Just give me a moment here. Yes, nahi rasadrite kastid artha pravartate. So that's his statement. So next, please. Okay. So now the question is, Bharata was dealing with theatre, but how do we apply it to the separate poetic tradition? We also had a poetic tradition which was in many ways separate and relatively independent of the theatrical tradition. And there, rasa was not central. We had alankara and all kinds of figures of speech and all kinds of linguistic analysis of the poem. Next, please. Next. So people saw that there were some kinds of poems or verses where there was perhaps even no alankara or figure of speech, but it was suffused with emotion. When you read the poem, you felt a certain emotion which was conveyed to you. But so what they did was they tried to subsume this sort of verses which had a kind of emotional texture or flavor to them as a kind of alankara. So you had things like Rasavad, Alankara, etc. But these attempts were still not satisfactory. Next point, please. So what Abhinavagupta does is, because by that time, the whole notion of Alankara itself was, this use of Alankara itself had sort of, in a sense, degenerated poetry in many respects, because people were trying to show off their virtuosity in projecting figures of speech, etc. So there was also a practical motive and also a theoretical motive for which Abhinavagupta elevates suggestiveness, dhvani, as the soul of poetry. So he makes the claim that ultimately this suggestiveness, not saying things directly or even through implication as in figures of speech, but through mere hints and clues, that this is the soul of poetry. Next, please. So Abhinavagupta talks a lot about not just rasa, but also about vastu, that is facts, and also figures of speech. But vastu and alankara can be conveyed both literally, through denotation, and also through suggestion. Next point, please. But rasa can only be suggested, vyangya. That is the ultimate poetic meaning for Abhinavagupta. So ultimately, everything else converges on rasa as the poetic meaning. So Abhinavagupta himself clearly states somewhere that his real intention for writing this, the Lochana, is for Rasa-dhvani. So he goes through very detailed and sophisticated analysis of individual poems, how every even the most minute elements of language contribute to rasa, and how the figures contribute to rasa, etc. So this is important. The reason I'm saying this is because some of the critics of Indian aesthetics, for example, Marie-Claude Porcher, French scholar, actually dismisses Abhinavagupta precisely because of this reader response theory, and says that Abhinavagupta himself is confused. That Abhinavagupta is brilliant in his analysis of poetic language, but then by introducing and embracing this notion of Rasa-dhvani, he has confused linguistics with aesthetics. See, as it says at the top, is Rasa-dhvani a linguistic or an aesthetic category? So she says it is actually a confused category, and she has a long article on that. Next, please. And what is the difference between, it would also be, theatre is considered a total art form in the Indian context. So everything else, poetry, music, is sort of goes back to the Natya Shastra. So Abhinavagupta's Bharati is actually a comment not just on theatre, but on all of art, actually. So because the total art form. So it would be easy to think that, poetry is some kind of just a reduced form of theatre. In fact, Abhinavagupta himself says at one point, because he's commenting on both these treatises, theatre and poetry, that poetry is really fully enjoyed only when it is dramatized, natyayita. See, like when you listen to a poem by Amaru, there is no natya there. But through the vyangya, suggestions, all of that, a nayaka, nayaka, the responses, what they are feeling, their interactions, all of these are suggested. And that is the beauty, because, next point, please. Because dhvani poetry is rarefied speech. See? So the same thing that Bharata is doing through with visuals and music and all, which contribute to the rasa, the poet has a greater challenge. He's using speech, and he's using speech in a very sparse and suggestive manner. And it also demands more from the audience, because in a theater, you can just basically sit back and just enjoy, like watching a movie. You just sit back and enjoy all the emotions going on. But a poem, it demands a recreative effort from the reader. See? So you have to basically get all the suggestions, and very often you have to read and reread, and then to fully appreciate the poem. And what is important is, in doing this, because you are reading the poem, rereading it, and all of that, but ultimately all from the point of view of rasa. So what happens is the so-called objective linguistic meaning is merged into a greater aesthetic whole, and that greater aesthetic whole is a rasa, which is an emotion, an aesthetized emotion. So what Abhinavagupta really does, and Ardhavadana assumes, is actually they don't make this kind of a dichotomy between object and subject. Object and subject, actually, the opposition is actually transcended. Those who are familiar with Abhinavagupta's Trika philosophy and the Pratyabhijna will know this is a constant theme in Pratyabhijna philosophy. So it would be surprising if it were not applied to the rasa experience as well. Next, please. Okay, just a minute. So as I said at the beginning, in reader response theory, meaning evokes different emotional responses. So the idea behind reader response theory, those who advocated it, especially from the 1940s to the 60s in this country, in the US, with regard to English and Western literature, is that it encourages readers to be objective, critical and objective. So you read a poem or a text, literature, with a critical eye, you understand the meaning which is being conveyed by the author, and then you approach it with, despite the fact that you share same cultural universe, you approach it in a critical way, in a different way. So it's meant to encourage students readers to be critical in that sense. Whereas in the Indian context, as we have already seen, you actually evoke the same response. And that is aestheticized emotion, which is called rasa. This is a fundamental difference. Say sadharanikarana ensures the same rasa for the whole audience. Next, please. Okay. Entire audience enjoys the ashraya. The ashraya is like Rama or Sita or Ravana, whose emotion we are enjoying through identification. Next, please. And this is important too. The reason why it's called Sadharanikaran is actually it unites people. It unites people through a shared experience, rather than dividing readers, which is what reader response theory does. And this, it's not just aesthetics. There is a very important social function. Because the Sanskrit theater was, in fact, like you take a piece like the play like the Mrichakatika, most of the play is in actually Prakrit language. I think there are at least 7 different Prakrits, and Sanskrit actually is just a small portion. So there are people from all classes, all castes who are watching. And the idea is actually to create an experience that unites people together. And actually in my paper on for IGNCA on Abhinavagupta's Rasa aesthetics and Bharata's sacrificial theatre, I actually try to show that the Mrichakatika is actually a sacrifice. And the sacrifice played a similar role, actually brings people together, it unites them. And this is precisely the reason why in Greece, theatre was so important. The reason for Greek tragedy, etc., actually brought the whole community together in that shared experience. And that is why there are ritual origins and this importance. If you're non-Greeks, we're not really allowed to watch the theatre. So a very similar function, though in a very different context in India for Sanskrit theatre. Next, please. So what Abhinavagupta has done, you see, for example, this notion of Sadharanikaran, Abhinavagupta did not come up with it. Bhattanayaka came up with it. So here again, people like Pollock, for example, says that, oh, Abhinavagupta borrowed, stole, plagiarized this idea from Bhattanayaka, and he's an ungrateful guy because he not only plagiarizes, he starts criticizing Bhattanayaka and calling him Mimamsaka Agrani and all of that. I basically replied to him, look, if we had no Abhinavagupta, we wouldn't know that there's such a person called Bhattanayaka.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if he wanted
I
to
said that
plagiarize,
also.
why did he bother to mention his name even? So, but what Abhinavagupta does, he takes his idea, basically his idea of Sadharanikaran, and as I said, there's a ritual underpinnings to these terms, not just an aesthetic terms. There are hidden ritual underpinnings to it, and that's why Bhattanayaka takes it from Mimamsaka and Vedic ritual, which Abhinavagupta completely accepts. Even the Vedic ritual side he accepts, what the Vedic Chodana to sacrifice does. But Abhinavagupta, you see, like Bhattanayaka has got so many different functions of speech: Bhavakatva, Bhojakatva, Sadharanikaran. So how these three processes all really fit into one another? The sequential process is not very clear from what we know of what Abhinavagupta says about Bhattanayaka. It's not clear. So what Abhinavagupta does is get rid of Bhavakatva, Bhojakatva, and all of that, and he says just there's Rasa-dhvani. And this is a cognitive process, very important, not just a linguistic process. It's a cognitive process which brings together linguistics, emotions, etc. So he shows how through Tanmaya Bhavana and generalization, which operate in Rasa-dhvani, thereby, in fact, Rasa-dhvani itself, through the processes involved, brings about identification and generalization. This is very important. Next point, please. So, as I said, he unifies drama and poetry. So this is very important because, as we know, after Anandavardhana, he was very highly, Anandavardhana's theory of Dhvani was very highly contested, not just for aesthetic reasons, because he introduces a third function of speech, which was a newfangled notion. He was attacked on all sides, and then some people like Kuntaka and all, they stayed on the sidelines without accepting or rejecting, somewhat trying to be a kind of syncretic in their approach, and all of that. And so it's only after Abhinavagupta that really Anandavardhana became Anandavardhana's notion of Dhvani as the soul of poetry, Rasa-dhvani as the soul of poetry becomes established. And then afterwards, people like Mammata and Kavya Prakasha and all, they become basically a textbook idea. Next, please. So, and this is important. Rasa is enjoyed as a unique cognition, pratiti, sui generis. See, it's not like anything else. It's unique, it's alaukika. And the reason is, rasa is experienced without reference to self or other. So the objection was raised long ago. How is it that we enjoy Sringara in relation to Sita? Sita is the wife of Rama, and we are enjoying Sringara when we watch her and Rama together. So there's some kind of auchitya involved. It's not just moral impropriety, but it's also it's an aesthetic problem. So okay, if you see two people, lovers, Romeo and Juliet, so why should we enjoy that? That's Romeo loves Juliet, Juliet loves Romeo. That should leave us indifferent, right? So what Abhinavagupta says is, actually the rasa is depersonalized. Sadharanikaran also implies depersonalized. We don't feel as if I am in love, or we don't feel as if this person, that other person, third person is in love. There's just love. His famous Bhayanaka, his description of Bhayanaka in Kalidasa's Shakuntala. So this is important. And one reason I am bringing this up is because I just recently attended a workshop with Vaidik Bhattacharya. He's coming out with a very important book on the invention of literature and world literature in the colonial period of India. by the British and the politics of behind the aesthetics and all of that. And he makes this claim, and I largely agree with him, not fully, that this whole notion of literature, the response to literature as being something unique, which he says came from this contact with India, as being something unique, self-standing, self-sufficient, without being non-imitative. You see, Bharata says theatre is an imitation of life, lokanukara, whereas the modern idea is literature is not, doesn't imitate anything. It's self-referential. This idea is a new thing, which came with the discovery of Sanskrit literature, etc. And this affected the whole of European literature. Very bold and ambitious thesis. His book is going to come out later this year. So what I pointed out was that actually this idea is already there before in Sanskrit aesthetics. This idea, and this is Abhinavagupta constantly underlines this. But what is very interesting is that the idea of literature as anukara, as an imitation of the world, that is also there. See, Bharata says that, and then Abhinavagupta in both his commentaries emphasizes the notion of purushartha, that is saying inculcating right action in the world, proper action in the world among the readers or the samajikas. So these two exist side by side, and they are not seen as contradictory to each other. So in fact, I invited him to take a look at this because he might have to reframe his thesis in a slightly different way. So, okay, next point, please. So in rasa theory, this is the main point. Shared meaning, the meaning is shared, okay, is the enjoyable, depersonalized emotion called rasa. I think that's the end, right? So, thank you very much. It's open for questions.
We are probably not able to see questions, but because it's my favorite area shared with Sunthar, I think I should definitely participate in this. Actually, when Anandavardhana begins his Tantraloka, already he is talking about three artha vrittis, Vachya, Lakshya and Vyangya. And when Rasa-dhvani is being called as Asamlakshya Krama Vyangya Vachidhvani, Asamlakshya Krama Vyangya is already a kind of artha only, because it is Vachya, Lakshya, Vyangya. Artha.
Yes, yeah. Oh, yes, okay.
Vachya, Lakshya, Vyangya. So, Asamlakshya Krama Vyangya is the name given to Rasa-dhvani. Whereas Alankara Dhvani and Vastu Dhvani are Samlakshya Krama Vyangya Vachidhvani.
Yes.
So this Asamlakshya Krama Vyangya Vachidhvani for Rasa-dhvani already is making it as Asamlakshya Krama Vyangya. Vyangya is a kind of artha. So that is already there.
Yes,
and
definitely.
What Abhinavagupta is doing is elaborating the classification of Rasa-dhvani as Asamlakshya Krama Vyangya Vachi by Anandavardhana.
Yes.
And while dealing with Artha in Vakyapadiyam, in Vakyakanda, Bhartrihari gives the meaning Pratibha for Artha, Vakyartha. Actually, for him, all Artha is basically Vakyartha.
Yes.
And he gives the name Pratibha for this. And while giving various meanings for Pratibha, he includes emotion also as one of the Vakyartha in Vakyakanda. So the foundations, you already mentioned in some of your discussions that while dealing with Kashmir Shaivism, people usually forget about the indebtedness to Vakyapadiyam.
Yes.
Yeah, I noticed this.
Actually, my teacher, Rameshwarja, used to say, because he was an expert on Vakyapadya, he says that in many ways, Kashmir Shaivism is just a refinement, Shuddhi, some Shodhana of Vakyapadya. I completely agree with him. And actually, to be more precise, I would say what happened is that by the time of Dharmakirti, the Buddhists had taken over the Vakyapadya. They took seminal ideas of the Vakyapadya and basically turned it against Bhartrihari himself, but they treated Bhartrihari as an authority. They did this so successfully that many people thought that Bhartrihari was a Buddhist. What the Kashmiri Shaivas are doing is actually they are reclaiming the Vakyapadya from the Buddhists. So,
My father published an article. My father published an article in Sanskrit about how actually Tantraloka and the whole Dhvani theory was an application of Vakyapadiyam to Kavya, Shravya Kavya.
Yes.
So that way, this foundation of emotion as meaning was already there in the Vakyakanda Pratibha section of Vakyakanda, where Vakyartha, various kinds of Vakyartha were already being discussed.
Yes.
Yeah, please.
So as you say, Nagaraj Guru, it is clear. It is clear all the time. And when and for me, this was very strange too at the beginning, because I come from I don't come from a Sanskritic background. I came from a very westernized background to India, filled with romantic literature and all. So Sanskrit poetry itself seemed strange to me, because it was so different the way the emotions functioned there and all. So you see, when you go to a guru, whether it's Abhinavagupta or somebody else, you want to learn something new. If you already know everything, why go to a guru? So when you go to a guru, you listen carefully and things don't make sense. You approach in all humility and try to make sense, because it is there. Not just what Abhinavagupta is saying, it's also already there. But what I find in much of Western scholarship, like even with Pollock and Schulman and all of that, is that they come with already preconceived ideas from the West, you see, which have their value. And when they come across something which seems strange, they don't start really trying to question the baggage they have brought, you see. For them, they immediately assume that, okay, emotion cannot be a meaning, Emotion is our reaction to the meaning, not the meaning, you see. And then they say, why is Abhinavagupta? I'll give you one example. For example, Sadharanika. So Schulman says, the Indians say that when we watch Rama and Sita, for example, there's the same problem I mentioned just now, we enjoy Sringara. He says, actually what we are enjoying is not Sita, but womanhood as a Samanya. See? The Sringara is towards womanhood as Samanya. But nowhere does Abhinavagupta or anybody else say this, you see?
No, in fact,
they're putting it into his mouth. When they say that it is Rasa
they are even
depersonalized.
contradicting Abhinavagupta. They are even contradicting Abhinavagupta, because while Abhinavagupta, while listing the 7 obstacles for Rasa enjoyment, he includes this inability to overcome gender and other distinctions also.
Yes.
So, to view Sita as a woman is an obstacle for Rasa enjoyment. As part of Sadharanikarana, overcoming gender distinction also is a requirement.
You see, we enjoy Sita and we enjoy Juliet in very different ways because they are unique. They are unique. What is the Sadharanikaran is the depersonalization of our enjoyment. See, we don't enjoy that as some other person, as we don't enjoy it as self, in relation to self. We enjoy
I may interject, Sundharji, there. We have just a few minutes before we move on to Mark Sir's presentation.
Yes, sorry, I've overlapped.
No problem. So Priyamvadaji has asked you questions. If you could just...
Yes, I just want to join in. Can I?
Yes, of course.
Okay. I mean, again, I thank Rimpelji and Professor Paturi. I mean, listening to Sundar is always a pleasure, and I don't think, I mean, in contemporary scholarship, who knows more about Ras than Sundar? And he is very modest, very humble when he says he doesn't know. I mean, of course, he does come from the Western background, but still I think he is deeply rooted in Indian tradition and Indian background. I remember because he has been discussing so many words with me and writing to me. I mean, so how, I mean, how passionate he was. So, Sundar, thank you so much. Just, I mean, some comments and one question, that's all. So, if your time permits, I think it's not only Natyartha, because you see, it is Kavyartha also. Rasa is Kavyartha also, both.
Yes.
So, this is Kavyartha Rasa. And in fact, Abhinavagupta repeats this, Kavyartha Rasa, Natyartha Rasa, both. Another thing, you see, just one, I mean, bhav, your translation, I don't know, I'm not questioning, but I'm just, I'm curious to know. Bhav as emotion and bhav as chitta vritti, are they the same thing? Because you see, as at one place, Abhinavagupta says, Abhinayanam hi chitta vritti sadharanata patti prana. You see, now if you remember this, so chitta vritti sadharanata prana, and then again, so but I think the chitta vritti has a larger connotation than the bhav. So that was one question, whether bhav is emotion, then how will you translate chitta vritti?
Can I answer that first?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. No, chitta vritti, like as in the Yoga Sutras, etc., is it's not just restricted to emotion. All our mental processes are sort of chitta vritti, and yoga is to sort of, not suppress, but yes, sort of make them disappear, the chitta vritti. So emotion will be one kind of a complex chitta vritti. You see, feel emotion, we have thoughts related to the emotion, we have various kinds of psychosomatic impulses to do things. So chitta vritti has a wider scope than emotion. So emotion is just one kind of chitta vritti. And then rasa is something happens to the chitta vritti, which, sorry, so
just to intervene. I mean, you see,
yes,
when he says abhinayanam hi, chitta vritti sadharanata patti prana sakshatkar kalpadhyavasaya sampadanam. Now, here you see, this is sakshatkar kalpadhyavasaya sampadanam. So, and how this is the chitta vritti sadharanata patti. Now, this is so you see, this is in a sense is referring to this sadharanikarana, because this is sadharana patti. So, in that sense, so that's why you see, I mean, it just a little bit of confusion. That's all.
So what is the question? The second question.
The question is, because you see, translating bhav as emotion.
Yes.
That's the only thing is this. So, I mean, is the translation emotion doing justice to the term bhav?
When I use the word bhava, it's a short form for sthayi bhava. So in Bharata, sthayi bhavas are the 8 sthayi bhavas or the 9 sthayi bhavas. Yeah, so those are all emotions, what we call emotions, right? The sthayi bhavas. So I've been using the word bhava, in a shorthand way of referring to sthayi bhava. And those sthayi bhavas are emotions. Actually, they're not even emotions. They are emotional dispositions.
Right.
So the actual emotions are the vyabhichari bhavas. I feel happy, sad, angry. So, but underneath them is a permanent subconscious emotional disposition. That's why it is sthayi. It's permanent underneath the vyabhichari, which are transitory. There is a sthayi state of attitude, an emotional attitude. So that is there. Yes. And then what happens to this emotion when it becomes rasa? So that, in fact, Abhinavagupta's whole thrust is to make the distinction between sthayi bhava and rasa. Actually, what Abhinavagupta says is that, in fact, this is important, because after saying everything, he finally says, actually, we don't experience the sthayi bhava at all. We experience only rasa.
Yes.
And it's only through analogy, through analogy and through correspondence, we say that the sthayi bhava has been transformed into rasa.
Another question, thank you so much. just again,
I don't want to take Mark this too much time.
Right. Okay. So I think I stop questioning you because there are 2 or 3 questions, and
please go ahead, Navjeevan ji. If you wish to ask, please. We are happy to extend this.
Yeah, I am fine.
Okay.
Because I insisted with Dimple ji that I had to start on time.
Yes.
So I want to extend that courtesy to Mark as well.
So,
yeah, please go ahead.
Yes,
please
sir.
go ahead.
You see, you just referred one thing. I mean, this is Ras is the Natyartha or Ras is the Kavyartha.
Yes.
But Abhinavagupta at one place says Natya itself is Artha.
Yes.
So,
yes.
Would you distinguish between Ras as Natyartha and Natya as Ras Artha of
because actually when Abhinava says this, yes, by that point, yes, he has shown that Natya itself is not something outside. Mm-hmm. That whole Natyayita thing, so when I come to poetry also, he says Natyayitam, it's only through dramatization that the poem becomes. So there's no drama going on in poetry. The drama is in your mind. Yes. So the Natya is ultimately a pratiti. It is a bodha. Ultimately, Abhinavagupta says it is a bodha. It's a pratiti. And it is a kind of reflexive form of consciousness. It is a vimarsha event. Yes. So at that point, there is no distinction between the Natya and the Rasa. See, we don't experience a Natya and then we experience a Rasa as something else. We experience the Rasa through the Natya, through the Tanmayi Bhavana. So all these other things, they are part of the Rasa. That's what gives a unique, that's why each time we experience Rasa in a particular scene or context, the Rasa is different. See, the emotion may be the same, but that particular instance is different because of all the other elements which are there, which are different, which are converging on Rasa. So actually, this is, I can't go into this.
No, that's right.
In the Vivriti Vimarshini, not talking about theatre, Abhinavagupta uses a lot a distinction which he makes in discussing Nyaya categories, yes, between Pradhana Paramarsha, you must be familiar with it, yes, Pradhana Paramarsha and Gauna Paramarsha.
Yes, that's
so
right.
Most of the analysis, say how is it, what is the relation between adjective and noun?
Your frontal consciousness, I remember.
Exactly. I actually use the term I borrowed from a Western thinker called Polanyi, subsidiary awareness and focal awareness. Yes. So when you're enjoying Rasa, your focal awareness is on the Rasa. Focus is there. But there are lots of other things which you are subsidiarily aware of. And without these subsidiary elements, there would be no Rasa. You see? There would be no Rasa.
That's right. I mean, you see.
But you are not conscious of them separately. You're only conscious of them. That is why the Natya can become Rasa. No, Natya does not just evoke Rasa or produce Rasa. It is Rasa. That is his ultimate statement.
Uh-huh. I mean, you see, I totally agree with you. The only thing is because you see that there are 2 different statements. One is Natya is Ras is Natya Ras is the earth of Natya.
Yes.
And another is Natya is the earth of Natak or Rupak or Kavya, whatever it is. So
yes.
Because you see, so I have a sense, just
both are correct.
You see, Tatra Natyam Namo Natagata Bhinay Prabhava Sakshatkaraaya Manaiko Ghan Manas Nishchaladhyavasayaha Samastu Natakanyatam Kavya Visheshacha Dhyoti Yortha. So there you have this Natya becomes Artha, and here you see we are talking about the Ras as Artha. That was
yes. So both are correct. You see, so they use this word. I think Anandavardhana or no, I think Bhartrhari himself, Apodara Buddhi.
Yes,
For analytical purposes, we make distinctions. We have you see a joke. When you listen to a joke, you laugh. If you try to analyze the joke will be no longer funny. but we want to find out how the joke works, we have to analyze it.
Right.
And while analyzing it, the joke is not funny, right? When somebody tells a joke, you start analyzing it, you won't laugh.
Yeah, that's really
So it's the same for rasa. So through this apodhara buddhi, we have to go and say vibhava, anubhava, this is happening, that is happening. But if you do all that while watching the play or listening to the poem, you will not experience rasa.
Thank you so much.
So that's what I mean by saying that both are correct.
Right. Thank you so much. Just one small question. Ras, you have translating Ras as a unique cognition.
Yes.
Would you call it a cognition or experience?
Actually, experience. I called it experience at first. But you know, for Abhinavagupta, everything is ultimately bodha and pratiti. Ultimately, you know, I mean, from the Pratyabhinda perspective, ultimately everything comes down to forms of consciousness.
I think bodha, for bodha, you see, bodha itself is a kind of experience. But because the word cognition, I mean, just Ras as a unique cognition, or Ras is when we say it is pratiti, so it is an experience. Pratiti,
both, because Abhinavagupta, Anubhava and Pratiti are not two separate things.
Yes, they're not
maybe
two separate.
In others, maybe in other systems they are separate, but not. And Abhinavagupta actually uses the word bodha, pratiti, other kinds of. Yes, so many terms, and each term makes sense from a different perspective. Actually,
that's right. Thank you.
Abhinavagupta's epistemology of cognition is actually the same word cognition. When used in the Abhinavagupta's epistemology, pratiti becomes bodha. Pratiti has to become bodha.
Pratiti is bodha, no doubt.
Yeah.
Every cognition is an experience. That is the question. Would we equate cognition with experience? That's the question.
I would do it the other way. I would say we would equate experience with cognition. If something is not cognized, it basically doesn't exist. Everything exists ultimately on supreme consciousness. And it is also true in the...
We'll be entering into a different domain then.
Let's continue this discussion by email separately or WhatsApp.
Yeah, now I get you, Professor Rastogi. Sundarji, probably what Professor Rastogi is saying is that experience is what is cognized.
No, I'm not saying
exactly.
That. I'm not saying that.
Okay.
You see, when I use the word experience and emphasize at the very beginning, it was actually not as opposed to pratiti or cognition. It was as opposed to concept. The rasa is an experience.
Yes.
Before it was a concept. So the opposition there is between concept and experience.
Yes.
We can have a conception of something that we never experienced. See? So the Western scholars are trying to conceive what rasa is and having problems. You see, for example, Pollock, his guru, he studied under Ingalls at Harvard, wouldn't agree with him. I'm sure of that, because if you read his book, there's an article which I published in that same volume, Makarand Paranjape, where he says this very clearly. You know, so because Ingalls was a great rasika of rasa, that's why he bothered. That's why he was so keen on translating this into English, so that people who didn't know Sanskrit could also enjoy. And he translated these verses into, they don't literally, because these are not literal translations, because his aim was to evoke the rasa of the verse in people who didn't know Sanskrit.
Thanks both Sundarji and Professor Rastogi.
If Pollock had paid attention to his own guru, he wouldn't be raising these questions.
No, in the West, you have to be against your guru. Okay, now we'll invite Dr.
So Sundarji comes with his fresh morning energy. And I'm sure he's mindful of the fact that a lot of us have been here since morning. So Sundarji,
I'm sorry.
much as we would like to extend the session, but we still have 3 more speakers and all of them are wonderful. So yeah. Thank you so much, and I wish we could continue beyond it. So now.